And we are live. A little delayed because Father Whiteford and I were just having some fun before we went on air. He's talking to me about his listserv days when he first talked about this issue. So how were those archaic internet days? Do you think they were better that back then?
Well, I mean, it was a simpler time. Not everybody even had internet access when I first got online. It was mainly people who were government employees or connected with universities. And then when CompuServe came about and AOL, you started having this influx of the average people in online discussions. But prior to that, it was a much more limited slice of the universe, and the web wasn't in existence. And so we all communicated by email, and we had email discussion groups. And the reason why that's connected with the topic tonight is that in the archive of the Indiana Orthodox listserv, I had posts that I had spent quite a bit of time putting together on this subject that I assumed would be available forever, and they're gone.
It wasn't on the way back machine?
Well, back in the days when fax machines were sort of like, top of the line technology. So, but yeah.
It's interesting because I think the topic tonight, and we're talking about Saint Pope Hormisdas, Saint Pope Agatho, and Pope Adrian I. They wrote letters, if not ecumenical importance church-wide. And a lot of the information people have access to, even with the days of the internet, is really a Latin-based manuscript tradition and a certain lens of interpreting those manuscripts. And so, like we were talking about before we went on the air, the danger with the technology is, one, this kind of instant uploading of stuff that may not be edifying, right? So if you have a false narrative that's not edifying, or if all you see is one manuscript tradition that's not necessarily edifying, but we also have the opposite, right? We now could very quickly find out what they already were publishing about more than 100 years ago, about differences in the Greek manuscripts, differences in how these things were interpreted, quick access to other letters from these popes, which kind of give us some background into what really was going on. How were these letters really accepted? We won't rehash everything, obviously, from a show that I did about, I don't know, 10 days ago or something on the Formula Hormisdas itself. We'll do some review. But otherwise, we're going to try to broaden this, talk about the other topics and the manuscripts and anything else relevant to help an Orthodox Christian understand, how do we understand people in communion within the church, important people. Bishop Rome would have been the most important person in the church at that time, and saints even. So let me, so to say, hand the microphone over to you. We could start maybe with the Formula Hormisdas, unless you want to go in a different direction, and let's start fleshing that out.
Well, basically, what had happened was, after the Council of Chalcedon, you had ongoing controversies because there were a lot of people who didn't accept Chalcedon, and really the Fifth and Sixth Ecumenical Councils were both held in response to various attempts to try to see, was there a way to bring the moderate Monothelitists back into the church? And so different people tried different ways to finesse the issue. And I believe it was like 520 was when Pope Hormisdas wrote this document, and this had to be agreed to and signed by the bishops that were entering back into communion with Rome after one of these early controversies. And in it, he basically makes the statement. He appeals to the Petrine origin of Rome, and says that Rome has never erred in the faith, and that the people who are signing this were agreeing to be in line with the faith of the Roman Church. And Roman Catholic apologists, of course, point to this and say, well, see, here we have a pope who said that the Rome was infallible, and the East agreed to it. And and it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. When this document was presented to the Eastern bishops, there was a lot of discussion. There was some pressure by the emperor put on these bishops to go ahead and agree to it, but basically they agreed to it with the understanding that up until that time, Rome had not erred in the faith. And so if you interpret the document in terms of just describing what had happened up until that point, they didn't have a hard time affirming that Rome had been consistently Orthodox. Because in the early centuries of the church, Rome always had been a bulwark of Orthodoxy. But the Patriarch Constantinople, when he signed it, he actually appended a statement where he said that the sees of Constantinople and Rome were New Rome and Old Rome were one see. So he basically was saying, yeah, everything you said about Rome, I'm agreeing to that, and it applies to RC as well. So now you could say, well, that's your interpretation of how they signed it. How do we know that that's really how they viewed it? Well, I think the key is you really have to look at what happened with the Fifth Ecumenical Council, which happened a few decades later in the 550s. And in that council, you had a couple of issues, but the three chapters, these were three statements by various figures that were controversial, and the Emperor Justinian wanted to have them condemned, and the Eastern bishops were inclined in that direction. Pope Vigilius did not agree with that, and he was actually taken by force by the emperor to Constantinople. So he was present at the time of the Fifth Ecumenical Council, but refused to attend any of the sessions. And finally, the Fifth Ecumenical Council ended stating that the three chapters were heretical, and also essentially saying that if Vigilius didn't agree to it, that they were going to depose him, and that he was a heretic. And Vigilius actually issued one letter in which he defended the three chapters, only to be followed because Saint Justinian, the emperor, who is a saint, refused to accept that document. And basically he retracted that document and then finally issued a letter in which he agreed with the decrees of the Fifth Ecumenical Council.
He did it twice.
And so if the Eastern bishops, if the understanding in the church was, well, Rome is the head of the church and everybody has to agree with him, and if you disagree with the Pope, you're ipso facto a heretic, they would not have proceeded with the council without the Pope agreeing to appear. If they were told the Pope doesn't want to come because he doesn't agree with what you're trying to do, they should have dispersed at that point and said, well, okay, we're wrong. Or, if they were just a bunch of schismatics that were going forward with this council, the Fifth Ecumenical Council wouldn't be accepted as the Fifth Ecumenical Council. So the fact that it is accepted as an ecumenical council means that regardless of what you may think about how everything went down, you have to agree that the decisions that they did make were infallibly true, and they didn't care that the Pope. I mean, I shouldn't say they didn't care, because obviously they wanted to get the Pope to agree, because getting the Pope to agree they knew would be a key to getting the Western Church on board with what they were trying to decide and bringing peace to the Church. But they didn't allow him disagreeing with what they wanted to do to prevent them from doing it. And ultimately, the Pope gave in and agreed, and so the Fifth Ecumenical Council has been accepted ever since.
Yeah, it's interesting because when it was clear that Vigilius wasn't gonna consent to the teaching of the council in a timely manner, they pretty much said, okay, all that stuff you wrote to us secretly, now it's public. Pope agrees with us. And they said explicitly, we do not excommunicate Rome, but we depose him.
Right.
So if there's any doubt whether or not the council could depose a superior bishop, that should be settled. He did not answer to 3 summons, which again, that's how Nestorius was deposed. That's how Dioscorus was deposed. And that's how Vigilius was deposed until he recanted.
And I would encourage anyone who's interested in this topic to get a copy of this book. Let me see if I can get focused.
I can see it.
The Council of Constantinople of 553, and it's edited by a Roman Catholic scholar.
Father Bright. Yeah.
I got a copy of it a couple of years ago and read it while I was on vacation. I figured I might make a dent into it, maybe read a couple of chapters. I found it so fascinating to read all the commentary and then all the documents of the council that I wound up finishing it while I was on vacation. So I enjoyed it tremendously. Not everybody would find this light reading.
Now, where were you on vacation? Because maybe that's what put you in the zone.
I went out to see, my wife and I, we went out to see a family that was from Pennsylvania.
Okay.
That had moved back to Pennsylvania. So we went and they live out in the country. And on that trip, we went to Gettysburg. So on the flight out there, while I was at their house and while we were at Gettysburg, whenever I had time to read, that's what I was reading. Well,
I think we need to get David Bentley Hart and Father Kimmel to Gettysburg, because then they'll actually read the Fifth Council. But all right, so that aside, that's on a tangent here.
Yeah.
And so with the Formula Hormisdas, we see this context that you laid out for us in quite a bit of detail. That the idea was that, right, Belisarius was the general and Justin and Justinian. It was very clear that, I don't get the wrong Germanic tribe whose powers collapsed in that time, but was it the Goths, the Ostrogoths?
The Goths, yeah.
The Goths are collapsing. Belisarius, we know as in Justinian, reconquers North Africa and then Rome. And so it was becoming very clear at this time, we need to seriously bring the Roman Church back into the fold. And the centrifugal force was Constantinople. And there was no doubting this. And that's why soon afterwards entered the era of the Byzantine papacy, where every pope was a Greek, or the diplomat from Rome to Greece, and who was hand chosen to replace the next pope. And sometimes not so nice ways. But this is the context of the Formula Hormisdas, which is right before total subjugation from Constantinople of Rome. Right? It's right before that.
Right.
This gives Rome a very big hand to play, where the Pope could be pretty audacious. And he was. And the popes that followed him were not quite so audacious until maybe really Vigilius, and it kind of blew up in his face. He tried out-politicking everyone, and you weren't going to out-politic Justinian. But that aside, as many of the viewers here are aware, Pope Hormisdas sent his legates with a document, the formula, and he sent them with a letter, which was with instructions saying, I give you permission to remove certain excommunications. All right, so we look at this historically, don't want to take this to mean that's a letter that proves he was willing for the formula to be totally altered in different manuscripts, because that's not what the letter says. But it does convey a certain level of flexibility. He was going to give the legates to rewrite that letter.
Right.
What we do know later, and you referred to this in your comments, about this sort of force that Justin and his nephew Justinian were exerting to try to get the formula to be signed. I'm going to read it. It's a letter of Justin to Hormisdas, and it says, but there have been several cities and churches, both Pontic and Asian, and especially Eastern, whose clergy and laity, though thoroughly assailed by all threats and persuasions, nevertheless to no avail, have been influenced that they should abrogate and should remove the names of bishops whose repute has flourished among them, but they count life harsher than death, if they shall have condemned the dead, if whose life when alive they used to glory. So I read that because we have on historical record that, yes, they're using force. He was telling Pope Hormisdas, we're using the force to get them to accept your communications. Now, the thing is, when we talk about this in modern 21st century apologetics, no one cares about who was excommunicated. They might remember Acacius Viorite, Lucky, Peter the Fuller, Timothy the Cat, whoever the heck he was. Yeah. They remember these guys' names, But like that's what they care about. They care about the Vatican I stuff, right? Because that's the anarchinism. We live in a post-Vatican I world, and good Roman Catholic apologetics has not got past Vatican I. It's like Vatican II has never happened.
Right.
And so for that reason, you would think if all these people are resisting this document, then clearly it must have been the papal prerogatives that were so offensive, because that's what offends us now. But yet that's not what they're offended by when you look at the historical documents. They're offended by the excommunications, right? Like the letter that I told you that Pope St. Hormisdas sent with the legates said you could change some of the excommunications if you have to, right? Because that was the real controversy, whether or not the Bishop of Rome used fine honorifics for himself. This was very common. St. Pope Leo spoke of, it was another Emperor Leo, just to make it tougher, and he spoke about how the Holy Spirit gave him the ability to make perfect decisions when it comes to discerning doctrine. So they were very used to these high honorifics. It wasn't controversial. And as we spoke about in our previous show, the Marianites, when they got actually before it actually became a big deal, they got the formula and they responded back with their own honorifics and affirmed excommunications, and they made no mentions of actual ecclesiastical prerogatives. So how do we interpret that? Which clearly they understood everything to be honorific. That's why they responded with an honorific.
Right.
And then that's why they responded with excommunications, because that's what the real point was at issue. So why bring this up? Because it's not because people don't have good intentions, because their minds are set on a certain way of thinking that Vatican I instills in their minds. And us responding to them get used to that, and we get trapped in this paradigm. But if we're looking at this historically, just pretend you're the atheist historian, you're the liberal Protestant, you're just doing this because it's a day job. You don't look at this as a serious document teaching papal prerogatives, because there's no other contemporary evidence that shows that anyone took it that way. And to take it that way would be incredibly intellectually dishonest. Not to the person who has all these presuppositions that can't read it any other way. They're being very honest to the presupposition. Right. But to someone more impartial without those presuppositions, it's a very untenable position.
Basically what Roman Catholic apologists tend to do is they select anything in church history that beefs up the claims of Rome, and they ignore all the stuff that does the opposite. I remember years ago, and this is probably back in the days of the Indiana List era, but I remember having debates with Roman Catholics where they started quoting from Orthodox services statements about St. Peter. And if you take those quotes in isolation, you would think, well, gee, the Orthodox Church, has this highly exalted view of Peter that makes him totally different from all the other apostles. But I pointed out, well, look at the service for St. John the Theologian. You find very similar kinds of things. I mean, the service are hymns of praise, and people at that time, they heaped it on. It was a cultural thing. When my wife had our first child, there was a Russian lady at the parish we were going to who had grown up in China. So she really grew up in a pre-revolutionary Russian culture that no longer exists, unfortunately, because the communist revolution in China put an end to that community. But she had a very Eastern, to put for lack of a better term, cultural background. And my oldest daughter, she was a very beautiful baby. She's a beautiful woman now, but what this lady said one Sunday was, "Oh, she is so beautiful. You must have another one. I beg of you." and it's always struck me that you would never hear an American talk that way. I mean, you have Americans say, "Oh, she's very pretty," and that kind of stuff, but you would never say, "Oh, you must have another one. I beg of you." But that's just sort of the hyperbole that people from a different culture will put in there sometimes, and you shouldn't take it beyond the intention of the author. And also when you're looking at things, statements from various saints, documents that you find, like the ones that we're talking about, if you ignore all the other documents that put those things into context, you can make this kind of a case. But when you look at what happened at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, or the Sixth Ecumenical Council for that matter, it just becomes very clear that the people the fathers of those councils did not have a Vatican I view of the papacy.
It's interesting because, as you were saying, they'll on the listserv, I've heard a Protestant apologist, James White, call it Peter derangement syndrome. Any mention of Peter, any mention of honorific automatically equals this.
Yeah.
But what if we apply that to every other honorific or everything that kind of made Peter seem like less? So, like, for example, in the third letter of Cyril to Nestorius, he says, both Peter and John are of equal honor because they're both apostles. When's that get quoted for the papacy? Never. And they go, oh, well, he wasn't really talking about ecclesiastical prerogatives there. Well, actually, I agree with you, but that's exactly the point. You can't just find a statement in isolation and run with it. Go means whatever you want it to mean.
Right.
I'd like to think reading history in the fathers, and more so the fathers than just secular history, is in a sense an empirical study. Why? Because the lives of the saints are living and they're continuing, and we have saints today that live according to the same thing. So we actually have something to look at. And
right.
So in the lives of the saints are inconsistent with what we think words of saints, to present or past, mean, then that gives us a good indication you're interpreting it wrong. And so because the Holy Spirit is still active in the church today and within the canonical boundaries of the Orthodox Church, that gives us an ability to understand these things appropriately and ironically consistently with how the saints themselves wrote about these things. So like when we're talking at the Formula Hormisdas, the kind of apologetic we gave tonight is something that is consistent with the historical record. The Roman Catholic apologetic is only consistent with their reading of Vatican I. They have to reinterpret everything else in written history that pertains to that document in order to make Vatican I work. And to quote Mike Lofton, because he taught me this, he said, it's like shooting the arrow and painting the target around wherever the arrow landed. It's not actually trying to hit the target.
Right.
And this is where we also have humility. You spoke, I find it really awesome when you speak to people that came from cultures that just don't exist. Like I remember I was at a Thanksgiving with someone who was like a 10-year-old child in Nazi Germany. He was in the Battle of Berlin, for example, hiding in a basement. So like people like that won't exist soon. So once you lose that ability to talk to them, you have no idea how they used to think back then.
Right.
And so you have this limited window. Now, with us interacting with this, most of our window is the English language, and some of these historical episodes are really not covered in scholarship, the English language, all that well, particularly the Formula Hormisdas. Fortescue has a 14-page booklet, and booklet might be even too kind to call this pamphlet, but it's a booklet. It's published by the Graymore, and every single scholarly work on the subject, other than a friend who's an Anglican scholar wrote in the 70s, but even from Yale University Press did a work on the Syrian Orthodox Church, and it's about the Monothelitism schism and everything. Even like Yale University Press in recent times, I think that was printed in the last 10 years or so, and it's a $200 book. They got 50 pages on the topic, and yet the only thing they're citing is this 14-page booklet where if you actually read the footnotes in the booklet, he apparently did not read the Greek. He miscited Greek and stuff in those footnotes. And so it shows we got to have humility, right? Because we want to go google.com, what really happens at the Formula Hormisdas? And we want the answer in English. And guess what? It doesn't exist yet. We're just starting to get the conversation rolling tonight. So are we in this sort of epistemic doubt? We don't know what the church is. We don't know what the right doctrines are. And the answer is no, because the doctrine is living and alive, and it's in the church right now. You don't need to, it's not like this fossil record and it's Jurassic Park. We got to find the mosquito and the ambers. They get the blood out and they can reclone dinosaurs. That's not how this works. The dinosaurs of Orthodoxy are still roaming the earth. Doesn't mean they don't have problems, but they're still around. So that'd be my last comment in the Formula Hormisdas, unless you have any others, Father.
Not on that one, no.
So we will move forward, which I think is the most interesting of the documents, because it's one, written by a saint, and two, we do not have massive manuscript differences between the Greek and the Latin to try to explain away some of these very papal sounding statements. What I'm talking about is the letter from Pope St. Agatho, who is arguing against monoenergism and I can't pronounce these words right, Sophistianism in the Third Council of Constantinople. And so I'll premise this discussion with the following, and then I'll give the floor to Father John, and then maybe I'll get a little more nitty-gritty, which would be this. For one, the full minutes of Constantinople III have not been translated yet. So this also gives difficulty to us who are interacting in English. It doesn't exist in English yet. And because there's so little research in English, there's not really a firm understanding in modern scholarship of, okay, well, how many conflicting manuscript records are there of this? Like you read in Father Price, it's not like that's the first time the Fifth Council was translated. He's now doing the Seventh Ecumenical Council, for example. That won't be the first time that council was translated. However, he kind of brought to bear, there's these other differing things in manuscripts, which maybe the older translations only had one Greek and one Latin. That's all they had. And so we don't really even have that fleshed out yet with Constantinople III, where tonight we could give you a fully fleshed out. We know this categorically to be true about this letter of Pope St. Agatho. What we're going to go with is stuff that's been out for about 100 years, because that's really the only translations we have available. It was done by an Anglican, by the way. But again, it was an Anglican who quoted, I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, Bishop Hyperbole, who's a Roman Catholic bishop, quite liberally. And so he would have been within a certain Western paradigm. We're Orthodox, so some of these things might sound a little strange to us, and some of the choices translation might not be always the best. So the full minutes are not available. And another thing in that translation is that it hinges mostly on the Latin. Doesn't mean he doesn't ever cite the Greek, because you see him cite the Greek in footnotes. But he says, if you read the footnotes, you can tell that he's going more by what the Latin is saying, in the sense of the Latin. Maybe he was better with Latin. And so it's very common in translations. You'll get Greek scholars translate the Greek New Testament, and they'll go look at the King James to see how they translate. You go, wait a second, don't you know Greek? Why do you need can't you just translate it from scratch? That's usually, very few people are so excellent at a language, they could just do it from scratch. And those that do, we could think of a recent New Testament translation done the last couple of years, usually fail very badly at it as well. So that being said, unless you want me to continue, Father, do you want to give any insight you have the letter of Pope St. Agatho before I get into it?
Well, I think the key to understanding what he says in that letter, he reiterates, he says, that no heresy or no error could be attributed to the See of Rome. This is in the context of a council that goes on to anathematize his predecessor, Honorius, and by name. And that's an anathema that was affirmed by, I believe, St. Agatho, but certainly by later popes. And St. Leo II, Pope of Rome, we have a quote from him in which he said that Honorius did not illumine the apostolic see, but something by pernicious betrayal. He distorted the faith. So whatever Pope Agatho said and however people read it, that's the context of the letter. And I think that the way I would read what he's saying is that even though Honorius fell off the wagon, we're not going to attribute the errors of this one man to the Church of Rome as a whole. There's no evidence that the Roman Church embraced the Monothelite heresy or the Monothelite heresy, as a whole. It's a fact, however, that when the Patriarch of Constantinople wrote to Honorius, his brother bishop, and said, "Hey, what do you think of this?" That Honorius said, "Yeah, that sounds really good. I agree with that." So he affirmed heresy when he was asked for his brotherly advice, and the idea that he was not functioning in his office as the Pope when he wrote that response is just nonsense. I mean, what does it mean to function in the office of the Pope if, when you're asked by another bishop, is this teaching heretical, you're not functioning in that office when you give an answer? In the Gospels, St. Peter was told that the devil wanted to sift him like wheat, but when he was converted, he was to strengthen his brethren. Well, this was an opportunity for Honorius to strengthen his brethren if he was going to do it, and he did. So clearly, you don't have infallibility coming out of this council, and you can try to sweep it under the rug all you want, but Rome clearly affirmed that Honorius was a heretic and anathema.
Yeah, it's interesting because I love the expression, the one you were saying about the Russian lady and your family. Because, by the way, I tell my wife, she found the pregnancy very difficult. She was sick all the time. The baby's so beautiful. The baby, clearly not for me. I said, you gotta make another one. So, but I mean it, but it takes two to tango, so to say.
Well, it's one thing for a husband to say that to his wife, but you wouldn't normally say that to somebody else.
It depends how cute the kid is, though. It depends how cute the kid is. So that being said, let's take a statement written by someone who we know clearly doesn't mean what it sounds like he means. And I'm going to quote Patriarch Bartholomew, and it was written on 9/11 last year in 2019. And he said the following about the Patriarch of Constantinople, or the Patriarchate. He said, until the end of the ages, this is just so people know they could Google it. Google his letter to the Archbishop Christamos of Cyprus. All right, so they gave the date and the letter. He wrote, until the end of the ages, to the chagrin and shame of the recalcitrant, I can't pronounce the word, spirit that hates the good and those inspired by him, in Constantinople shall live steadfast and immovable, the most precious and holiest of possession of our race and our blameless faith, our holy great church of Christ, the mother and mistress among the churches. So if you want to take that statement and go, he's saying that the race and the faith will be immovable in Constantinople. That must mean Constantinople's indefectible. That must mean all the things about Vatican I applied kind of clearly. I mean, whatever, it's like this fun thing to kind of beat up on Patriarch Bartholomew. We know he doesn't mean that, because he also has, for example, to quote him, he said the Ecumenical Patriarch has never claimed the primacy of administration or authority among the Orthodox churches, nor has it imagined itself to be enveloped with infallible authority. That's also Patriarch Bartholomew.
Right.
And so, right, that's in a plain statement, and obviously in the statement written to Archbishop Christamos, or however you pronounce it, we get the kind of common Oriental flattery that we read in these ancient documents, and we know that's not what he meant. And so that's what I want to second what you said, Father. Well, they just condemned Honorius, and they called him a heretic, and they said in the council, as well as in Nicaea too, that he propagated heresy. So they don't teach, because this is the new Roman apologetic for the last 150 years, because before that they weren't so slavish to this. They could say, he just let it be taught. He just didn't do enough to stop it. He wasn't really so much a heretic himself. That's not what the councils say. The councils say he propagated the heresy. Now, secular historians might take issue with that and say the councils are wrong. But again, we're not secular historians. We're speaking this as Orthodox Christians. Our presumption is if we venerate the fathers of the council, they're saints, they have icons, that we're going to accept their rationale. That's the point. Otherwise, why are we venerating them for being a father of a council? A lot of the other stuff they did wasn't so great. So that being said, we know if they're saying he propagated heresy and that he taught heresy, then they're saying he's a heretic. And so clearly people signing onto the document, which I'll get into a little more detail in just a moment, would have not said,
echo what you said.
I accept it.
You don't normally anathematize somebody for what they didn't say. So the idea that he just failed to stop a heresy and that was why he was anathematized, well, so did most of the people on the planet or in the church, that didn't do anything to stop the heresy. Old ladies in Italy didn't do anything to stop that heresy. He endorsed a heresy.
But here's how a scholastic would respond to that. They excommunicated and anathematized themselves, right? So it's inferred from what's there. You can infer it from what's there, from the implication. I'm joking, obviously. Now, let me read how some of the patriarchs, for example, signed onto this document, right? You just had allegedly, Vatican I way of reading what Pope Agatho says. And again, we're presuming, audience, that you've read this letter, right? Like, we're not going to just read a monologue and here's what the letter says. So presuming you read this letter, we're aware that Roman Catholics are going to say, well, this proves that everyone accepted, that the Pope is infallible and he's indefectible and the faith will always be Rome, et cetera, et cetera. Then why did the Patriarch of Constantinople, George, say when he signed on to the council, this is in session 8, he says, I have diligently examined the whole force of the suggestions sent to your pious fortitude, as well as by Agatho, the most holy Pope of Rome, as by his synod, and I have scrutinized the works of the holy and approved fathers, which are laid up in my venerable patriarchate, and I have found that all the testimonies of the holy and accepted fathers, which are contained in those suggestions, agree with, and in no particular differ from, the holy and accepted fathers. Therefore, I give my submission to them, and thus I profess and believe. Here's a letter from, I can't pronounce the name, Prosphoneticus, to the emperor. So they're sending it from the council to the emperor. They write to him, therefore, being inspired by the Holy Ghost, and all agreeing and consenting together and giving our approval to the doctrinal letter of the most blessed and exalted Pope Agatho, which he sent to your mightiness, as also agreeing to the suggestion the Holy Synod of 125 fathers held under him, Peter spoke through Agatho. Right? So you always hear, Peter spoke through Agatho. Look at their submission to him. They're just in awe of Peter on earth. But you actually read the whole statement, they're saying they gave their approval and they consented to it. But it gets better because they wrote a letter to Agatho. So, right, how do we understand Agatho's letter? When they signed on to it, how they understand it? Well, they wrote a letter back to him, so this should give us an idea. In their letter back to Pope St. Agatho, they said, thus illuminated by the Holy Spirit and instructed by your doctrine, we have cast forth the vile doctrines of impiety, making smooth the right path of orthodoxy, being in every way encouraged and helped in so doing by the wisdom and power of our most pious and serene Emperor Constantine. And then one of our number, the most holy praesoul of the reigning Constantinople in the first place, is sent into the Orthodox compositions sent by you to the most pious emperor, as in all respects agreeable to the teaching of the approved fathers, of the God-instructing fathers, and of the holy five councils. We all, by the help of Christ our God, easily accomplish what we're striving for. For as God was the mover, so God also, he crowned our council. Right? So they're saying, we agree with you, Pope St. Agatho. The Holy Spirit also inspired us, and God has crowned us. You don't need to ratify our council. He's already done it. And so we read these statements, not the Vatican I presuppositions that Roman Catholics read into them. And the sad thing is, this is all like a newadvent.org. This is a Roman Catholic web. I wish there was an Orthodox New Advent, honestly, but this is all out there. So this is what, like I warned about, is the problem when we read a historical document with a Vatican I presupposition and not presupposing that all the other documents from the time help us interpret the difficult statement. So that'll be my comment before I go more into the letter itself. Let me give you a moment, Father John.
Well, for example, if I was to read the Gospel of John, you would never have me, after I read it, saying, I have scrutinized the Gospel of John and found that it's in accordance with correct teaching, and I thereby submit myself to its authority. We assume that it's authoritative because that's our faith, that there is no error in it, that if we think it's wrong, we're the one that's wrong, not it. We don't scrutinize the scriptures to determine whether they're correct or not. So if the Pope was infallible and if everybody believed that this was the case, there would be no need to scrutinize, only to submit yourself to the authority. And if you would just say, if I deviate from it in any way, I know that I'm wrong.
And it's interesting, right? Like when it's not clear the council's ecumenical, they could be that discerning about it. We don't do that now. In my discernment, or at least most of us don't do that now. In my discernment, the Fifth Ecumenical Council is it's been received by the Church. The Holy Spirit spoke through that council.
Right.
Again, there's qualitative differences between that and the word-for-word inspiration of the Scriptures. But the point is, it's no longer up for debate. This is the council. God spoke through them, and that's what they were saying to Pope Agatho. So clearly, when we see that to Pope Agatho, we realize that for the Spirit to speak through the council, it doesn't hinge upon papal ratification. Now, of course, we're aware of the Roman Catholic apologetic, which would be, well, they were wrong when they said that. That's just a private view of those conciliar fathers. But we just have to be honest with ourselves. If we choose to disregard parts of the council, then what do we actually know to be infallible for? How they're even useful documents? Why have they been held in such high regard? Why is it that everything other than something that proves the papacy is somehow negotiable, or something that proves the Immaculate Conception is somehow now negotiable? Everything becomes a private opinion that's inconsistent, instead of us looking at what's really the teaching of the fathers. So yeah, that's a good point. Now, reading Agatho's letter itself, there's some slight differences in the Greek, which are fairly common. We'll get into this when we get into Adrian's letter, which is they sometimes smooth over some things because it would just sound insulting to the mostly Greek audience, right? The Greek bishops who, Patriarch of Antioch, he's a Petrine bishop. Patriarch Alexandria, he's a Petrine bishop. Don't act like you're my boss. And we're not going to have the time tonight, but there's a phenomenal letter. I just read the full thing today, written after Constantinople I. And they were like, it's funny because they speak of St. Ambrose and Bishop Ambrose, and they mentioned the Pope. I think it was Damasus at the time. And they said, we don't belong to you. So like they actually respond to the Western bishop saying, you can't dictate to us. And by the way, we ordained Flavianus, Flavian of Antioch. So they were totally disregarding Rome. And this is in the minutes, what's not really the minutes, the letter coming from an ecumenical council, which, by the way, called itself ecumenical, not waiting upon the Bishop of Rome to rubber stamp it, just like Constantinople V, by the way. So there's not a lot in the Greek that's smoothed over compared to the Latin. At least, again, we're speaking of what we know in English. I don't read Greek and Latin. And even those that do don't have the manuscripts right in front of them, or enough of them for that matter. There's a part where it speaks of the authority of the Bishop of Rome. And I'm going to bring up that part. I'm just going to click Control F here, by the authority. All right. So, like I said, there's no radical differences between the Latin and Greek renderings of the letter. But in passing, Pope Agatho writes, the see of Blessed Peter, the Prince of the Apostles, by the authority of which all Christian nations venerate and worship with us. That's the Latin. Well, taken literally by the Latin, that makes it sound like that it's by the authority of the Pope that there could be the church. The Greek is translated differently. It says, the authority of which for the truth all the Christian nations together with us worship and revere, according to the honor of the Blessed Peter the Apostle himself. So that's a big difference, right? The authority there is the truth, not the Bishop of Rome. And the honor is given to the Bishop of Rome in light of that truth, not that just by virtue of being the Bishop of Rome, that's the authority that all people could venerate and worship. Now, I know there's different thoughts in this. Some people think the Latin manuscripts to be so corrupted that maybe even the Latin isn't a faithful rendering of what the original Latin was. I'll be more charitable and say, I view these documents as diplomatic. I don't doubt even a saint, because we have saints that did this, he would try to take as many prerogatives as he can. And his legates are going to try to walk back the bare minimal. And what you see in the Greek is what they agreed upon when the council occurred. The same thing happened with Photius. Everyone likes to say, he was this forger in chief. There's all these Photian forgeries. And it's like, haven't you read the last 500 years of ecumenical councils where they come with a Latin letter and then the legates had permission to change what it was in Greek? It's called diplomacy. We even see sometimes examples of outright Roman forgery. I forget which canon in Nicaea, where they say to Rome belongs the primacy, and then it talks about the Alexandria and the prerogatives of other patriarchates. And not only the Greeks in Chalcedon, but even the North Africans in the earlier councils said, our canons don't say this thing about Roman prime. Where the heck do you get this from? And so it shows sometimes they try to sneak things in there to Latin to see they get away with it. You would like not to think of the saints doing stuff like that, but it's kind of like politicians and like they want money in their district and they kind of slip in, oh yeah, money to rebuild small businesses in my little town and in my district. So stuff like this finds its way into manuscripts sometimes. That's the most friendly and charitable interpretation I could give to say that the Latin manuscript's intact. There's also tons of forgeries, like the donation to Constantine and whatnot. So it can be totally just made up too. That's also possible. Unless we have a document from the 7th century, we don't know. It also is worth saying, which people don't think about, is if you look at Western history, if you look at manuscripts, there were ransacking Vikings. And so outside of Ireland and Rome itself, which Vikings never took over until I guess the Normans were really a kind of Viking, but they didn't like sack and destroy Rome. They actually built some very nice churches and stuff. But so all the manuscripts in the West were like destroyed other than like Ireland and Rome. And by the way, sometimes in Irish manuscripts, there's major differences in what you see in the Roman ones. So obviously in Rome, you're going to get very Rome-centric manuscripts. Now compare that to the East. Yes, Constantinople, you have a meddling emperor. They change every century what heresy they want to input into these manuscripts. That's an issue. But what kept them honest is there were monasteries outside the control of the power in Constantinople. There, for a large part of that time, you have manuscripts in the Sinai Peninsula, in Syria, outside of Jerusalem, outside of Antioch. There were Greek speakers. People don't think it, but there's Arabs today that actually call themselves Greek Syrians because that's what they consider. They don't look it, but that's ethnically, that's what they identify as. Yeah. And so in a weird way, you can't totally alter the manuscript and then have this look true across the board because it's just too big an area with not enough power that Constantinople could project. Otherwise, all the icons would have been destroyed, which they weren't. We got icons from before the 8th century and late 7th century for that matter. So that being said, it's possible there's forgeries, but just you could give your opinion. I don't think I need to take that tact, but I could acknowledge it's a possibility. I mean, what's your opinion?
Well, it'd be nice to read, some edition by a contemporary scholar who's really looked into all the manuscripts and could say if there were any differences. I think there's good reason to be skeptical when you see a quote that Roman Catholic apologists will use, because there were collections made by scholastics of these kinds of quotes, particularly after the Protestant Reformation, and a lot of these are fake or they're distorted translations. But when you look at a more modern translation, like the one that I was referring to of the Acts of the Fifth Ecumenical Council, I think that the level of scholarship you're dealing with there is such that it's unlikely that they would intentionally be distorting it. But as you said, I think that even if we just take the letter at face value as we have it, which, as you said, is based probably mostly on the Latin text, it doesn't prove anything because the Acts end with anathema to Honorius. And that's the one thing you can't get around is it clearly doesn't mean that all the popes have always taught rightly, because
it can't mean that. That's off the table. It's and I think here's where people get hung up on that letter. It has statements such as, "This apostolic church has never turned away from the path of truth. The Apostolic Church of Christ has both in prosperity and in adversity always held and defended with energy, which it will be proved by the grace of Almighty God has never erred from the path of apostolic tradition. Consequently, therefore, according to the rule of the Holy Catholic Apostolic Church of Christ, she also confesses that being Rome preaches that in him there are two natures, whatnot." Why did I bring this up? Because the papal or the papist understanding of this letter is whenever they see the words "this apostolic church," the Apostolic Church of Christ, the Catholic and Apostolic Church, the Apostolic See, they're always reading in Rome. Now, what we just read in, I think it's the 3rd paragraph of his letter, where we actually see even in Agatho's own letter, he says, according to the rule of the Holy and Catholic Apostolic Church of Christ, she, that is Rome, also confesses, shows he understood you could also speak of the Holy and Catholic Apostolic Church of Christ to be the whole church, not just Rome. So if you're making these statements such as, she's never erred from apostolic tradition, well, who? Rome or the whole church, right? Where you just need some people to be on the right path, and then you can say the whole church weathered the storm. So that's something that gets forgotten a lot because people are they want to read Vatican I in there.
Right.
And so they're gonna make the statement, well, he most likely was talking about the Roman Church when he made the statement. And I'd even grant that much, but then I could respond with this, which would be this. It was intentionally written in such a way so people would interpret that to be about the whole church. And you can even see that among the Latin patristic traditions. So, for example, the Apostolic Church of Christ, that it's not, we usually talk about the Holy and Apostolic Catholic Church. There's different monk years for the Orthodox Church. The term, for example, the Apostolic Church of Christ is used by Augustine in the Confessions and in Letter 34. Both times, he's not talking about Rome. He's talking about the whole church. So even in the Latin, if we're going to take that term from the Latin manuscript tradition, understanding it patristically from the Latin, we would understand that could be or should even be a reference to the whole church, not to Rome itself. So what's then all that, what's that word? What's the controversy then if we're making a statement that the gates of hell will never prevail against the church? There's no controversy. We all affirm that. Right. So,
well, but even if you somehow could make the case that he was referring specifically to the Church of Rome, it doesn't mean that the popes were all infallible and they always taught the truth because of Honorius. I mean, that's the fact that you can't get around. And for the most part, Rome, as I said, had been a bulwark of faith, and I think that the most likely interpretation, if he's not talking about the entire church, he means that the church as a whole in Rome has maintained the faith, not that not that the Pope, his predecessor, had maintained the faith. Otherwise, he would have found some way to argue that Honorius had not taught heresy and shouldn't be anathematized. I mean, if you're trying to imply that would have been a big issue and a big sticking point that he wouldn't have bended on.
And the fact that popes for the next couple centuries all had to condemn Honorius shows this is something they had to be on board with. They had to show they understood this.
Right.
That being said, other than the fact that if you read the beginning of the council, each patriarchate calls themselves an apostolic see. So that already takes out that only means Rome, because it's right in the beginning, all the apostolic sees. We have to remember that the Bishop of Rome making a statement saying, let's say Rome has never gone to error. Let's say you make that statement. We already make a statement the church has never gone to error. We can mean that if we mean not in every particular, at every single point in time, in every single way. So if we already accept that about the church at large, it's not irrational someone can make the same statement about Rome. And if we accept that, that means that papal infallibility does not need to be inferred from this, especially when, like you said, there's a condemnation for a pope that's a heretic, and it becomes impossible. It's what people forget. There were Roman Catholics that were against papal infallibility because they realized it was historically absurd. They realized even to be faithful Roman Catholics in the 1800s, they did not have to ascribe to that idea. Obviously, to be a faithful Roman Catholic now, you would have to. But that's a different story. So, I mean, there's more here on Agatho. We can't take all night about it. I commend people to read up more on the issue. And hopefully when it gets translated, may God bless Father Price with good help that it gets translated, and then we can have more of an intelligent discussion on it. But let's end tonight of talking a very interesting letter by Pope Adrian to the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And what makes this letter interesting for two reasons. One, due to disputes over Bulgaria and jurisdiction, even though that same Pope accepted the council, it really didn't get totally accepted in the West for political reasons. And also, number two, the West had its own kind of conciliar controversy. There's Hinchmar. He's a writer in France from the 9th century. And he spoke of the necessity for a receptisma, or in Latin, reception. And they realized this wasn't received, he was arguing. There needs to be a doctrinal reception for ecumenical councils. And so it shows Westerns reading the Latin minutes. We're not inferring from those minutes this idea from Vatican I. There's no consent necessary for the Pope to act, that he's indefectible, he's infallible, all these other things. So reading the minutes, I think it's telling are the differences between the Greek and the Latin. So before I get into that, let me give you the floor for any comments, Father John.
I didn't. You probably mentioned it, but I only remembered that we were going to be, or from discussing what we're going to be talking about, that we're going to be talking about the first two documents. But you prompted my memory enough to remember what you're talking about, but I didn't really dig into this one, so you're going to have to do most of the talking here.
Okay, well then interrupt me when you got something cool to say, by all means. So I'm just going to read statements, and there's only one source where this council translated in English. You could Google it. It's written by an Anglican that hates icons. So he hates everyone. It's kind of like David Bentley Hart translated the Second Ecumenical Council. It's a very interesting read if you read through it. That being said, I'll read a statement in the Greek, and then I'm going to read it in the Latin. So here's in the Greek. Pope Adrian said in the Greek version of the letter, Orthodox faith, it starts on page 49 of that sort. The Orthodox faith of those chief apostles, Saints Peter and Paul. In the Latin, it says Orthodox faith of Saint Peter. Why am I bringing this up right now? The reason this is important, because if you remember from St. Irenaeus, and he speaks of the importance of Rome, he speaks of the authority of the two apostles of Peter and Paul. We see in letter 74 in Cyprian's Corpus, it's really written by St. Firmilian. He speaks of, in passing, the letter of Pope St. Stephen, and he says he boasts of the authority of Saints Peter and Paul. So what's this indicate to us? It indicates to us that in Greek sources, because Irenaeus originally wrote in Greek, Firmilian obviously originally wrote in Greek, and that was probably a Latin translation sent to Cyprian, which is why we have it preserved. Rome always cited the authority of two apostles, not one. This sort of idea that this Petrine exceptionalism did not originally exist. And this Petrine exceptionalism apparently really was never fully accepted to any extent in the East, which is why in ecumenical documents like Nicaea II, even in something that's not all that important, they'll always make sure to name both, not just one. Because who's that an insult to? It's an insult to Alexandria. It's an insult to Antioch. They're also Petrine, but they might not claim to be Pauline in the same way. So that's why in these documents written to Eastern bishoprics, we see even into this late point in time in 787, still will cite the authority of two bishops, not just one. I will continue unless you want to interrupt.
Well, one thing, and this kind of goes back to something you were talking about earlier, but in the West, with the phrase the Apostolic See was commonly used to refer to Rome. But what has to be kept in mind is that unlike in the East, there were very few churches in the West that could claim to have been established by apostles. The East is chock full of churches that were established by apostles. And so in the East, if you were to just say the Apostolic See as a reference, people would say, which one are you talking about? Which Apostolic See? But I think that's just one of those quirks of the history of the West, is that they had this one church that was, that their primary church, that the one that was the primate or the patriarch of the West, and they had all this historic authority, but the rest of the churches, were established by other people. And so it was just a very different history, but it doesn't mean that by calling it the Apostolic See, that meant that it had some unique apostolic authority.
Precisely. And it's interesting, and I don't know if this is true, but it looks true. It's like you can walk in an Orthodox church, you still see a menorah there. You kind of see the vestiges of, these were once synagogues, probably mostly Gentile converts that heard of, yes, this was the Savior they're talking about, and they converted to Christianity. That became the Orthodox Church, really. That's what it still is today.
Right.
While in the West really was the pure Gentile converts that were pagans. They were not well versed in Hellenistic Judaism, which is really the bridge between Christianity and ultimately Semitic Judaism. And I just like to say, I remember reading Wisdom of Solomon to my wife, and I tried to see if I could trip her up and see if she'd think it's another part of the Bible. And she always knew, oh, no, that's not Old Testament and that's not New Testament. And I said to my wife, how do you know? She said, it sounds like it's in between. And it's true. The Deuterocanon, for example, was written, if you look at years, in between the old, the Hebrew Old Testament and the New Testament. And not only that, it was written by Jews at a time of Hellenism. So you could even kind of see how that's immersed in the writing. And so why is it relevant to this? In the Eastern churches, right, which apostolic see? All our churches are started by an apostle. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. You read the Didache, they just take for granted an apostle is going to walk to your church one day. He's just going to show up. It's like it just happens. That was not true in the West. If you were the Church of Carthage, the best you could say is, yep, some guy from Rome a few decades later came here with the gospel. There's a little bit of a different ring to it compared to, Peter sent letters to my church. John visited my church. Paul came to my church. There's a difference in the East, which is why we don't have the time tonight. You read St. Optatus, you read St. Augustine, they kind of take for granted that that it's really in the East that the doctrine's best preserved, that the church is really most fully found. Now, I'm not saying I actually even would agree with that, but you can see why if you were this Latin, right, you weren't speaking the language of the church. You were aware. It's like we as Orthodox speaking in English are not speaking the language of the church. You're aware that there's elsewhere in the church, the tradition's better preserved. The people culturally have had it longer. They understand it better. The fathers understood that, and the saints understood that. So that just may be a little side comment I made there. Yeah. But anyhow, back to the letter of Nicaea, let me read a Greek part. And so here's the Greek portion of the letter. It says, "And let your divinely received power," it's Pope Adrian writing, "give all honor to the most holy Roman Church of these chief apostles," in brackets, that's Peter and Paul, "to whom power has been granted by God the Word himself to loose and to bind sins in heaven and on earth. For they'll become guardians of your kingdom and will subdue all the barbarian nations under your feet, and wherever ye go, they will make you victorious. Now these same and holy chief apostles who laid the foundation of the Catholic and Orthodox faith have left a written law that all who have ever should succeed to their thrones should maintain the same faith and should continue in it even unto the end. And thus it is that our church maintains and honors holy images." So in short, he's saying, right, authority of Rome comes from Peter and Paul, but the authority of the rest of the church comes from their thrones as well. It's a plural. Now, what's it in the Latin manuscript? I think, guys, hold on to your seats. Latin manuscript says this: "For the proofs of his dignity are found in the sacred authors and in that unbounded veneration paid to him by all the faithful everywhere throughout the world. For the Lord hath made him," that's Peter, "who is keeper of the keys of heaven, prince over all. And this privilege has conferred upon him by the same divine person by whom the keys to the kingdom of heaven were granted. For he that was endued with such singular honor had before been honored to make that confession of faith on which the Church of Christ is founded. A blessedness of reward followed, this blessed confession by preaching of which the Holy Catholic Church has been enlightened, and from which other churches have taken the documents of their faith. For the blessed Peter, Prince of the Apostles, who first presided in the Apostolic See, bequeathed the principality of the apostleship in the pastoral care to his successors, who throughout all ages should sit in his most holy chair, to whom he left the power of authority. For just as it was bestowed on him by our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, so in the same way did he hand it down by divine command to the pontiffs, his successors, by whose tradition it is that we venerate the holy images of Christ." So I'm going to need a break because my throat hurts, which is, could you see the palpable differences in those two documents? And how would you, Father John, as a reasonable person, determine which is likely more historically accurate?
Well, I would say, given the history of Latin forgeries, you'd have to say that the Greek text sounds more likely to be correct.
But can't the boy who cried wolf eventually be right and there really be a wolf?
Well, are you reading from the Price translation of the Acts of the Seventh Ecumenical Council?
I'm not aware, unless that was just released. I'm not aware of that actually being published yet. I'm reading from the only English translation I'm aware of, which is from the 19th century. It's written by an Anglican.
Yeah, there is the Acts of the Seventh Ecumenical Council have been published. I have them. I just haven't had a chance to read them. But it's
How long ago? by the way?
I think I got it close to a year ago. I just haven't had time.
Are you in some mailing list? You're important. You're important guy. You get in. Okay.
Yeah, go to Amazon and type in price 7th Ecumenical Council Acts and see what happens.
I think it said I could pre-order it, to be honest. I did look at that, but I'm also a technical moron. But you continue. I'm going to look that up right now.
But it'd be interesting to see what he has to say about this, because he would, I'm sure, have thoroughly dug into the question as to which one would be had more plausibility. But just based on what I know without having read his comments, I would have to say that the Greek text sounds more likely to be correct, and that the Latin text sounds like some scribe at some point has maybe amplified it a little bit to beef up Rome's claims.
And not only that, this is when we have to look at the council itself and see, okay, how do they sign on to the council? And right, you're going to find the same sort of statements. You're going to find statements such as, I'm going to try to pull them up, where I've evaluated, I've looked into this, therefore I accept. So would you write such a statement if the Pope wrote a letter and it said it that plainly, that, he controls everything, he has it all, and you'd be, I critically accept this statement. For example, on page 78 of the English translation I have, and I'm going to get an answer to what you said. We'll find out how special you are. I'm sure you're very special. That the Peter and the aforesaid legate said, let this holy council declare to us if they consent to the letters, the most holy Pope of old Rome or not. And the holy council replied, we follow, we receive, we hail them with joy. So again, they had to consent to these things. Why would that make a difference if what that letter said is really what they heard? And again, in the Greek would give us an indication of what was probably read to them. Even if there really was a Latin original that said that, then certainly was not which was read to the Greek audience. The council itself also says of itself, they write to Constantine and Irene was really the real power broker. Constantine was kind of like a child, and the mother is reigning as really regent. Yeah. And so in the 7th session, they say the following, and they say, Constantine or Irene, our most faithful sovereign, summoned us together from every court of the chiefs of Christian priesthood in order that the divine tradition of the Catholic Church might be established by our common vote. We therefore, having with all exactness made the most careful and diligent inquiry, and having followed the truth as our great aim, neither taking away anything nor adding anything, have endeavored in all things to preserve all that belongs to the church complete and entire. So again, they're saying they're doing by vote, and that they made a careful and diligent inquiry. So that's not like, oh, we just accept what the Pope said. We have their letter to Pope Adrian, where they write, wherefore with former heresies, the error of this new pravity of the Christianity slanderers rage against holy images, he has subverted the word of grace and slain with the sword of the Spirit. All this has been brought about even as it pleased Christ our God, who is over all by means of our Orthodox most courageous sovereigns. I read that statement. It's not overly fantastic, but they're speaking of the council there. So they're right back to the Pope, not saying you did this. They're saying we did this too. The council writes to the Emperor Irene, and she says, they said wherefore having followed the traditions of the apostles and fathers, or as I may venture to say, being by similar inspiration of the Spirit made of the same mind with them, and being quite in agreement with them, and the 6 ecumenical councils, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if we have this whole document, we see this point where they diverge, right? The Latin of this kind of really exaggerated stuff, and the Greek kind of this milquetoast stuff that kind of sounds like the rest of it. Yeah. And then we see these later things where they obviously say it's by our vote, and we had the Holy Spirit. And the same, and by the way, right, we read that in the 6th council. You've read Chalcedon, you've read Constantinople II. They said the same thing in those councils. What's more likely true? The part that's consistent, not the red herring that only meets the presuppositions of Vatican I. And so us trying to be interacting with this honestly, I think it's incumbent upon us to look at it in that sense. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, the other thing I would point out is the I believe it's the first canon of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, endorses all the canons of the first 6 ecumenical councils. And if you look at the Council of Trullo's canons, which is also known as the Quinisex, the 5th and the 6th council, because if you are narrowly defining the 6th ecumenical council, it issued no canons. Only the Council of Trullo did. So, but that's always been interpreted, even by popes later on, as referring to the 6th ecumenical council. But in any case, the second canon of the 6th ecumenical council lists local and ecumenical councils and canons of fathers. And interestingly, there's one local council that's mentioned, and it's the Council of Carthage that was presided over by Saint Cyprian. And that council has only one canon. And that one canon states Saint Cyprian's view of baptism, which Pope Saint Stephen objected to. And so an ecumenical council endorsed a canon that was in direct defiance of an earlier pope. And that's the only canon of that council. So you can't say, well, maybe that one just got slipped in, or maybe they weren't thinking of that particular canon when they endorsed it. That was the only canon, and yet it's mentioned by name. And of course,
you're speaking of Trullo. I'm sorry, that skipped my mind. But, okay,
yeah. Or the Quinisex, which means the 5th and the 6th. But usually, I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the pope, but it might even have been Pope Adrian. But in the course of the iconoclast controversy, the canons of the Council of Trullo, or the Quinisex Council, became very important, because in those canons there is a canon about iconography, and it specifically talked about some incorrect icons that should no longer be made. And a later pope references this canon and says, well, the 6th Ecumenical Council said this, and so therefore icons can't be objectionable. So clearly, those canons are endorsed by Canon 1 of the 7th Ecumenical Council, because that canon, I believe, is mentioned in the minutes probably more than once, because it played such an important role in the controversy, because it was evidence of a view of iconography prior to the iconoclast controversy, where it didn't even enter into anyone's mind that icons were objectionable.
And Pope Adrian, in a letter, and there's I believe one other earlier pope, and they say that we accept all the canons. And Adrian said it's explicitly all the canons, and they're speaking of Trullo. Now, I actually don't think they meant all. They probably meant all that we have in Latin, which was much shorter. Right. But be that as it may, it shows that they accepted the canons of Trullo, and they understood that to have ecumenic authority. And by the way, I found out how I got confused. It's the paperback version that comes out March 31st, 2020. For our Father Christ. There's already the hardcover version, but that you have to click on the extra stuff to find that on Amazon. If you get to peek at that to see if he deals with that in more detail, I'd be interested before I spend a bunch of money on that, because I always go with what's free before.
I'll look at it this evening when we get done.
That sounds good. So unless you have any other final thoughts, we got one question here, and then I think we took enough of your time tonight, and I know it's appreciated by everybody. And so I'm going to show the question. Craig and Father Whiteford, would you agree with this statement that the living authority of the church today is a standard or norm for all dogmas? So I'll hand that over to you first.
Well, as long as you understand the living authority of the church can't be opposed to the historic authority of the church. In other words, the Pope, the church today can't say, well, you know what, we've decided that the church has been wrong about homosexuality for the last 2,000 years, and so we're therefore going to endorse gay marriage. Even if you had, the vast majority of the bishops signing on to such a thing, that wouldn't matter. Those were living, external authorities in the church. They're in defiance of the traditions of the church. But yeah, I mean, we don't just have a tradition from the past. We have a tradition that is living, in the sense that the church is still guided by the Holy Spirit, and the church is still there to answer our questions. But we know who's telling us the truth in the church by also looking back and seeing, is it consistent with what the church has always taught?
Yeah, and I think, interestingly enough, Nicaea II is a great case study in this. Anyone who slogs through the minutes of Nicaea II, they're looking for, give me all the great proof texts and icons and show me the history of icons. And they try. It's, remember, they weren't like critical historians in the 8th century. They had slightly different methods of inquiry. But most of the council, and I believe it's really sessions pretty much 3, 4, and 5, is spiritual lives. Go, wait, what? I mean, this is not even properly historical. They're like, oh yeah, Eusebius told the story about the woman with the flow of blood. She was healed and she had a statue. And we read the story of this saint, and in the life of that saint, Saint Savas, for example, he talks about, icon that worked a miracle. And we know this icon that did it. And you go, but, when are they going to get to 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century evidence of icons to prove they were there since the beginning? Why aren't they doing that?
That gets into an interesting point, because I think those of us living in the West and tending to think in a particular kind of way are tempted to downplay the importance of the lives of the saints.
Precisely.
And so if we're going to make an argument, we don't even think about appealing to the lives of the saints as we should. St. John of Shanghai, he knew the lives of the saints forwards and backwards. And my own bishop, who knew him very well, he was his clinic. He said that he always, if there was a question that came up, he would have some example from the lives of the saints to answer the question. He would find something that someone said or did that would maybe not directly, maybe, in other words, it might not literally address the question, but on the basis of principles, he could apply it. And so that's one of the reasons why, even though we're tempted to only read the scholarly academic works and works of theologians, we should make sure that we don't neglect the lives of the saints.
Precisely. And it puts us in this sort of uncomfortable middle ground, because again, we've got modern minds. So you're going to have liberals who are going to say it's like a living constitution. It's this living authority. It's this rubber nose, it's wax nose. It could be anything you want it to be. And then you'll have people, mostly Protestants, to say, unless you could show me uncontestable archaeological evidence that, a guy whose skeleton is in the midst of kissing an icon and he's dead, and it proves that's how they venerated the picture, you can't prove it to me. And historically, what we've seen in the church is there is, yes, real history, but the testimony and holiness, right? That's why it's empirical. The holiness of our saints proves our doctrines, and that holiness does not change over time. It's consistent. So if you're looking at all the lives of saints, and let's say it's for the last 3 centuries, and you've canonized these saints, there's no rejecting their saints, and they all do the same stuff, and they all do it the same way. Historically, that proves this is the holy, correct thing. It is a historical argument, but it's empirically proven because their holiness is validation. It shows the Spirit was at work.
Well, also, the thing is, we probably have fewer examples that most of us encounter than people in the earlier times had. But when you actually know a saint, you have a different perspective on things. If you've seen miracles, an atheist might make all kinds of arguments that God doesn't really exist, the Bible's a lie, you can't trust church tradition. But if you've actually experienced God in your life, those arguments don't have any sway. You might not be intellectually capable of engaging them as well as you might wish, but you just know that it isn't true because you've encountered that. And in my experience of having known several people who knew St. John, I'm struck by how having had that relationship, their faith was so strengthened. And so the fact that they had a living example, not just reading about saints in the book, but they had a living saint walking among them, gave them a very different perspective. And another more recent saint, St. Paisius of Monothelitism, I was my assistant priest was talking to someone who unfortunately had apostatized from the Orthodox faith back to Roman Catholicism. They were formerly Roman Catholic, and they went back to it. And he at one point he asked him, "Well, do you think that Saint Paisius is a saint?" And he says, "Of course I do. Well, don't you think that if the Orthodox Church was wrong and the Roman Catholic Church was right, that God would have revealed this to Saint Paisius?" And he didn't have an answer for that. And that's an example of how this living experience of saints gives you something that you don't just get from a book.
And I'm really wondering what's going to ultimately happen with Father Syzoev, if that will build up ultimately to a canonization. I find him very refreshing. Someone who lived in the 21st century. He had a blog and stuff, and
I'm quite certain he's going to be formally glorified. He definitely qualifies as a martyr, and as far as I'm concerned, he's already a saint. And people venerate him. There are already icons, but he's not formally been added to the calendar. But I'm sure that will happen before too long.
Yeah, I venerate him. I don't have an icon. We know where to get one, but maybe, who knows? Maybe Jordanville will have one soon. I don't know.
Well, before I had a pre-glorification icon of Saint John, and it looked exactly like any other icon, except it didn't have the halo painted on it. And I've seen icons of Father Daniel Syzoev that are the same way. It's iconographic. It just doesn't have the halo yet because he hasn't been officially proclaimed by the church to be a saint.
Mm-hmm. So we got another question slightly off topic, and if you don't feel comfortable giving an answer, by all means don't. The question is, what happens if the Jordan Synod accomplishes nothing due to the fact there's low turnout? Here's my answer. Nothing. Because you just said it's in the question. It accomplishes nothing. So I think the question should be worded this way. What will happen if it has low turnout?
Yeah, does that therefore mean it can't accomplish nothing? I think we'll have to see. What I could see happening as a result of this meeting is that the bishops that are there agree to call for an ecumenical council and to actually set a date. And the idea that only the ecumenical patriarch can convoke an ecumenical council just flies in the face of history, because I seem to recall that the Third Ecumenical Council was called by the Patriarch of Antioch against the Patriarch of Constantinople, and that's one of those ecumenical councils that we accept. So obviously, it doesn't have to be. It didn't have to be called by Rome, and it didn't have to be called by the EP either.
Now, unless there's only a conspiracy theory answer to this, I'm actually kind of flabbergasted anyone could seriously have the position. Like, when a Roman Catholic says that, at least they've got a falsified old manuscript record to go by. You know what I mean? Where's this idea come from where, like, Nicaea, there wasn't even a vicar for Bishop of Constantinople. Constantinople I was chaired by Antioch, and it was pretty much to even speak of, look, we retook Constantinople, we ordained an Orthodox bishop, so it's done despite Constantinople. We have with Ephesus, where, for example, both Alexandria and Rome excommunicated the bishop of Constantinople, Nestorius, and Nestorius received word of his excommunication because he received the third letter of Cyril, and because he had recourse to the emperor, he said, no, throw an ecumenical council. I refuse to accept these excommunications. So clearly then, it was from Constantinople, but it was from the emperor and flying in the face of these other things. So it's a strange theory. And I just don't, I think they're too knowledgeable to be saying this. So why?
Well, it's an ahistorical theory. And Antioch is third in the diptychs now, but at that time, Alexandria was the third in the diptychs. And so if the Patriarch of Antioch was to say, even by himself, if he were to issue a letter saying that Patriarch Bartholomew has erred in doing this, this, and this, and his teaching is neo-papist, and we're going to conduct it. We're going to convoke a council, and if he doesn't show up, we're going to try him in absentia. That would have the same weight as Saint Cyril doing the same thing, essentially, with or doing the same thing with Nestorius.
Yeah, I think what people forget is, one, if someone's summoned 3 times and they don't show up, they're canonically deposed.
Right.
And the only way around that is to appeal to who has authority above that. So, for example, if it's the Bishop of Constantinople and you have a meeting, let's say it includes Antioch and it includes Jerusalem and includes Romania, Moscow, really those guys aren't all that important ultimately. It would be, all right, well, we have Alexandria. They haven't been part of it yet, so you can't appeal to them. But what if, and this is the wild card, they depose both of them? Who do they appeal to? And the only thing they can appeal to is if they then join the council.
Right.
So that's something they don't talk about. We just never had it a point where I think there are 2 patriarchs deposed at once, which creates that issue. We've had it where even in Constantinople too, we had the Bishop of Rome deposed. So you could depose the top dog. There's not like, I'm the top dog, so your council can't do that. So I think, and this is my kind of, shot from the hip opinion, which is it won't accomplish nothing because it gets the ball rolling. Where they're going to be laying the framework. Here's what we're going to say is wrong, and when this gets more serious, these are the issues we're going to be dealing with. And now it starts getting to the realm of doctrine instead of squabbling over territory. Though this is very important. Ukraine has more people now than like half the Roman Empire back then. So
right.
this is huge.
Right.
So that aside, there's not only that issue. I think that Romania going on board turned this real. There's sort of this propaganda coming out of American-supported Greek newspapers and websites that are saying, oh, look, Poland's not going, which has like 500,000 people. That's like Romania is the church still that has, I think, the most parishes. It's even more than Russia for now. Doesn't mean they have more believing Christians, but I believe they're the most parishes. They're the strongest Orthodox church. If they're attending, that's huge. And if they're attending, Bulgaria might attend last second. And that's really, it's in the Balkans, and particularly Bulgaria, Romania, where I think the real legitimacy will come for this council. And I'm sure the EU and NATO is pushing very hard against it because they realize they don't want rapprochement between NATO members and Russia, obviously. They've seen this political. It's nothing to do with religion. They just see this as what's politically in store. And to be fair, I'm sure Putin doesn't see this. I hope he does, but he probably doesn't see this religiously either. A lot of these things are seen politically, but that doesn't matter. There's real doctrinal things at issue. It gets the ball rolling. And quite frankly, Patriarch Bartholomew is not the first to float these ideas. And so the blank's hitting the fan, and we got to start really working through this. I think we as Americans speaking in English are the chief victims. Ukraine's tasting what we've been experiencing now for decades, which is what do you have with 1,000 competing jurisdictions? Complete chaos. You as a parish priest, my wife and I get in a fight. We go to you for advice. We don't want to submit to your help. We can now go to the streets of the other Orthodox church.
Right.
It didn't work like that back then. It was the same bishop. He'd excommunicate you. So it's dangerous to my salvation, right? Because obedience is where us normal laity experience the obedience of Christ. So it's
creating canonical chaos, and in a local church that has an historic recognized boundary, and everybody always had recognized as being part of the Russian church. At least in the United States, you can say, well, look, after the Bolshevik Revolution, every church kind of did what they had to do to provide priests for their people who were here in the United States. And so we have this multi-level or multi-layered jurisdictional problem based on historical circumstances. And nobody really decided it was going to be that way. When it just happened. But in this case, you've got the introduction of a parallel jurisdiction by a decision, and there's no canonical basis for it. So it's creating canonical chaos. And when you look at what their justification is, they're basically making the same kind of arguments that the Roman Catholics do in favor of the papacy, So you have not just a canonical violation, but the teaching of error. This statement that now Archbishop Epidephoros issued, where he said that the Ecumenical Patriarch was the first without equals, and that was published on the EP's website. That's heretical. That's papism. If we believed in papism, we should have stuck with the first one. There's no reason why we should go with the number 2 guy.
He is the bigger and better one. And
Right.
quite frankly, the Pope that exists today probably would not even say that about himself. He might act that way, but he doesn't. He won't say it about himself.
Right.
I have a question about readings, and it is: I would like to read some Orthodox commentaries on Scripture. Are Father Dimitri Royster's worth getting? Any others? Or Father Whiteford, what would you recommend?
Well, I've not read Archbishop Dimitri's commentaries, but I'm sure they're okay. I'll tell you a free source of some patristic commentary, and that's an app you can download that's called Catena, Catena. And I'm not sure who put it together, but you can click on a verse, and if there's any commentary that they have in their database, it'll pop up. And you in the New Testament, you very often will find, multiple fathers, sometimes as many as like 10 or 12 patristic quotations on that passage. So that's free. There's also the Ancient Christian Commentary series, which is not cheap, but you can get it electronically, the whole set, in a program called eSword, which is that program is free. But if you can buy the Ancient Christian Commentaries as a packet to go into that, and I think Logos Software also does the same thing. You pay a lot less for the digital copy than you would the hard copies. And of course, there are individual commentaries that you can buy by various fathers. So it depends on which book you wanted to read. For example, with the book of Genesis, you could get the commentaries by St. John Chrysostom on the book of Genesis. There's also commentaries available by St. Ephrem. There's St. Augustine's commentaries. But then there are other books where you're not going to find a lot of patristic commentaries. And what St. Augustine says about how do you interpret the Bible, what he said is that if you interpret the Bible in accordance with the teachings of the church, then you won't go too far wrong. So if you don't have patristic commentaries available, but you read the passage in a way that doesn't contradict the teachings of the church, then you're at least not too far off.
And I'll get to that question in a second. God bless the app people. I'm like a technical moron, and I know a lot of the Catena app because I remember when they were put together is stuff that's from Aquinas Study Bible.
Yeah.
And so when I'm at a Bible study or something, I just go google.com, Aquinas Study Bible. Then I click a map, and it's all the same stuff there. So it's another resource you have if you're stupid like me. If you're more intelligent, then do all the fancy stuff. I also want to give this piece of advice, unless you're a super genius who can read original languages, which is read the Father, not always the footnotes. Like, for example, in the homilies from St. John Chrysostom on Genesis, when you read about Onan, whoever translated it have to put in, it's very telling. He doesn't once mention the spilling of seed as sinful. So you read that and you start taking the stance on, then maybe birth control is not bad, or masturbation, or insert whatever inference you could draw. I was taught by a monk, which is don't read the footnotes, don't read the introduction, just read the saint. Now, I wouldn't recommend that if you're going to write a scholarly article on something. It's more if you are studying a scripture and you're trying to understand the spiritual meaning, that's going to help you more than the translator's personal opinions. If you really, unless you want his personal opinion.
Generally, the translator of St. John Chrysostom's commentaries on Genesis was Robert Hill. He translated a ton of St. John Chrysostom's commentaries as well as other fathers. And I noticed the same thing that you're referring to. You obviously bought the book because you wanted to hear what St. John Chrysostom had to say. And yet you've got this translator who feels the need to keep inserting his own opinion. And he basically argues with St. John Chrysostom in many cases. Well, here St. John Chrysostom is just mistaken because he says blah, 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 blah. We don't care. We didn't buy the book because we wanted to hear what you had to say about it. We wanted to hear what St. John Chrysostom had to say. So I would say take the footnotes with a grain of salt. Sometimes the footnotes are helpful and interesting.
I mean, obviously tonight, right, we're making all these statements on the Greek side. I mean, how would he do that without footnotes, right? But I think for most interacting, you don't need it. In my own personal study, I have to admit, I like putting the Septuagint, and I like putting a translation of the Vulgate, and sometimes even, what you get from Dead Sea Scrolls, what you would get from the Samaritans. So I'm the biggest offender in this category. I'm just saying, if you're not already getting into that, be more worried about what the saints say. And I think that's more relevant. Right. I got a question, and the reason I'm just putting it up, even though it doesn't have a question mark, is he's the guy who came up with the idea for tonight's show, from Deacon Joseph Sweden. When will the next show be? I'll make this comment. I'm going to try to regularly at least do more kind of snippets on doctrines and on questions. Like I have stuff I've been sitting on the Immaculate Conception. I have stuff I've been sitting on Augustine, which I hope to get more detail on. Obviously, Father Whiteford wants to come on. He's always welcome. If even you want a platform to speak of any issue, you would always be welcome. But just so the audience knows, the idea is for all of us to preach the gospel wherever someone will listen to it and to edify one another. Right? To edify Christians. And so wherever that takes place, even if it's putting a tractor or a little paper icon at the gas pumps, the next guy picks up and he picks it up and go, what's this? I think actually little icons would do more than anything because the picture is worth 1,000 words. The point is that we take the time that God gives us and to worship, to pray, spend with our family, and also to edify others. And so I think Father John has been doing for years, since listserv days, and try to share what he's learned. This is not some huge YouTube channel that I have, and yet he's sharing that time with me. And I like to edify others with what I've learned. And I'm open to correction because it's about the truth. Right? We have confidence that God has revealed that to us in the scriptures and in the church. So we're not going to be afraid of, okay, well, you were here, correct this, or have you heard of this elsewhere? I think wherever people are open to hearing the truth, we should make it available. So that's my answer to that question. Father John, you're always welcome to come on again. If it works for you, we could always do something that's regular, or we just do it, shoot off the hip, whatever you like.
Sure.
So, yeah. So maybe afterwards we could hammer something out time. Yeah, I know Lent's coming up. That's really tough for priests, by the way, guys.
Yeah, things get a little bit busier in the next few weeks. With house blessings, it's been a pretty busy time already, but Lent's busy too. But we can work stuff out.
Sounds good. And I think this is just a comment that I'd like your comment on. He says, Matthew 16, 18, 19 proves papal supremacy and papal infallibility. Jesus says he'll build his church in St. Peter, and that whatever he binds on earth is bound in heaven, and thus infallible. Heretics. How could we edify this viewer who has an honest disagreement with us?
Well, I would say you probably want to read what the fathers have to say about that passage, because that's not how they read it. Generally speaking, they see the rock as being Peter's confession, or you could even say the truth of that confession. And I think some fathers even say that the rock is Christ, because in the Greek, Petros is like a small rock or a pebble, and Petra is the rock that's talked about, and that's like a big rock. So the fathers didn't read that in that particular way. And also, there's other places in the Gospels where Christ gave all the apostles the power to bind and to loose, and so in the Orthodox Church, we believe that that power wasn't just given to Peter, but that it was given to all the apostles. And Christ was speaking to Peter because he was the chief of the apostles, but not limiting it just to him, but in that capacity, giving it to all the apostles.
I will make this comment. I agree with you. The majority fathers and Roman Catholics admit this. Do not take that this is Peter and he's even the rock and this proves the papacy. That's a minority reading. Every serious, even Roman Catholic, admits this. But let me concede everything. And I've done a video on this. Let me concede everything and say, okay, it's Peter. Pope Saint Cyprian. I'm not Pope. Saint Cyprian. It's getting too late. He actually took the reading that it was the Bishop of Rome. Yet, if we, like we talked about, the Rebaptism Council, letters 72, 73, 75, it's very clear that though he interpreted that as such, that did not mean papal infallibility. It did not mean indefectibility. It did not mean papal supremacy. It did not mean that he could replace bishops, that he can unilaterally make everyone else in schism other than himself, right? Because he was excommunicated by that same Bishop of Rome, and he condemned him. And he had that interpretation. So I point that out as even if, because I agree there's some legitimate patristic interpretations where it is the Bishop of Rome, it's completely illegitimate to say that it meant papal supremacy, because our earliest interpretation of that from Cyprian is clearly not that. I'll just put up one comment, and it's really not a question, about reading the prologue of Oakreed. If you want to understand Orthodoxy, you got to do the prayer rules every day. You got to read the scriptures every day. And I think you got to read the prologue. You got to go through that. And
wonderful. I used to read it to my kids when they were little every evening.
Yeah, it's you got to read the prologue. And it's like you said, you start looking at situations in your life with the answers. Well, this happened in this saint's life, which is the point. So I absolutely agree. Thank you for that comment. Well, I think that's enough for tonight. We've been going on long enough. Very patient audience, a very patient guest. Father Whiteford, it's been a real pleasure. I'm grateful for you being tonight, and I hope to do this again sometime.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. Well, stay on. We're going to sign off for the evening, and we'll talk when the camera goes off. Good night, everyone. God bless.